The British Prime Minister believes he is the winner in the dispute over the Rwanda law, despite internal contradictions and absurdities. And that now there is a threat of further resistance in the House of Lords, as we saw. The House of Commons recently approved Prime Minister Sunak's plan to deport illegal migrants to Rwanda. That's, on first glance, is a victory for the head of government, but the right wing of the Tories will continue to push him forward. And it must have been a tough few hours for British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who emerged feeling battered despite winning the vote. And in the dispute over his country's asylum policy, he prevailed against resistance within the party, and the new law to enforce deportations to Rwanda in East Africa received the necessary votes in the lower house of parliament. And this means that it has cleared another hurdle in the legislative process. But for Sunak, the dispute over the direction of the Conservative Party means a difficult start to the election year. Several members of the right wing of the party had threatened to vote against their government because the law did not go far enough for them. And the plan is already being criticized by the UN Refugee Agency, for example. In the end, 11 of Sunak's party colleagues voted against the proposal. A total of 320 MPs voted for and 276 against. And British politicians have been arguing about the issue for a long time. On Tuesday evening, dozens of Tories in the House of Commons voted for 2 amendments that would tighten the asylum law. And this is a serious attack on the authority of any prime minister, as BBC reporter Chris Mason commented. Essentially, it is about the Conservative government's plan to send irregularly entered migrants to Rwanda without examining their asylum applications and regardless of their origin. They should ask for asylum in the East Africa state, which critics accuse of human rights violations. They are forbidden from returning to Great Britain. And to this end, Rwanda should be declared a safe country by law. A further judicial review citing human rights in Great Britain should be ruled out with it. But that doesn't go far enough for the right-wing Tories. They demand that appeals before international courts must also be prevented. There should be no loopholes. Robert Jenrick, former Secretary of State for Migration and once confidant of Sunak, even called for withdrawal from the European Convention on Human Rights. The Home Office now wants to instruct officials that if the court in Strasbourg objects to deportation flights, they must consult the government. This should then decide whether to override possible objections. A union criticized this sharply. Civil servants would be faced with an impossible choice, either to break international law, to defy the government, or even to resign their post. Migration has long since become one of the most important issues in the upcoming election campaign. The British must elect a new parliament by January 2025 at the latest. A date has not been set yet, but a vote is expected in the fall. The Tories want to use a decidedly tough approach to make up for the huge gap in polls to the Social Democratic Labour Party. Significantly fewer irregular migrants arrive in Great Britain than in the EU, and opponents of the project, such as the UN Refugee Agency, are outraged. The plans violated obligations to protect refugees, and the fact that the government wants to place itself above the courts by law also violates the separation of powers. The highest British court had declared the government's plans inadmissible, citing, among other things, the situation in Rwanda. The government has already paid hundreds of millions of pounds to Rwanda without anyone arriving there. And the project is primarily intended to serve as a deterrent. It's still questionable whether this will actually happen in the end. The pact was once thought up by then Prime Minister Boris Johnson, according to critics, to distract from the Partygate scandal. In the next step, the law will now go into the British House of Lords. That is the second chamber in the legislative process. And we know what happened there. But Sunak defended the plan in the House of Commons, and the voters want to solve the problem once and for all, he says. And for him, the agreement with the authoritarian president of Rwanda, that's Paul Kagame, is a central component of his promise to reduce the number of migrants. And Sunak's spokesman confirmed that the first deportation flights should take off by spring. In order to speed up proceedings, judges should be assigned specifically, and judges' associations question whether this is possible. The fact that Deputy Party leaders Lee Anderson and Brendan Clark-Smith resigned in protest on Tuesday evening meant a further setback. The two made it clear that they did not believe that the Rwanda draft would be successful in its current form. And Anderson in particular, who has a talk show on the right-wing broadcaster GB News, was considered an important campaigner because of his outspoken nature. Analysts are now talking about a civil war in the Tory party. The dedicated campaign strategist Isaac Levido recently called on the group to unite. Divided parties, as Levido said, fail, and Pat McFadden from the opposition Labour Party accused Sunak of weakness. He was too weak to lead his party and too weak to lead the country. That's what McFadden told the BBC about Sunak. The short-term resignations from their own ranks would show that the Tories are sinking into total chaos over their Rwanda prank. Analysts spoke of a civil war within the Tory party, and it looks like it's going to be chaotic and cause damage, as Sky News commented. Britain's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak believes he is still the winner after pushing his Rwanda bill through the House of Commons. But in the end, the rebellion on the part of his party's right that he feared did not take place completely. Of the 60 Tory hardliners for whom the law did not go far enough, in the end, as I said, only 11 voted against further consideration of the bill. For the others, the risk was too great that they would bring down their own government in an election year. Of course, they are undaunted in predicting an imminent failure of the government project. Because Sunak was unable to convince his critics, and for very different reasons, moderate and national conservative Tories are reluctant to follow the course that the Prime Minister has taken on this issue. The House of Commons drama of those few days has mercilessly exposed the sometimes bitter differences in the British ruling party. And now the law went to the upper house, where it faced further resistance. And this can lead to months of disputes with the judiciary over the legality of government policy. Because the law that Rishi Sunak is so desperately trying to push through was full of internal contradictions and downright absurdities from the start. And with his help, Sunak wants to deport thousands of illegal migrants who cross the English Channel to Rwanda, as I said. And if that is a deterrent, that is questionable as well. But Sunak vowed that this spring, at the latest, the first candidates should be brought to Rwanda and never to be seen again. And stop the boats is the slogan with which the Prime Minister wants to take advantage of antipathies against refugees among the population and go with this to the elections. However, Britain's highest court banned such a mass deportation last November because in the judge's ruling, Rwanda did not offer refugees the necessary security. And in return, Sunak's law simply wants to declare Rwanda safe by parliamentary resolution, regardless of the court rulings and despite all the facts. At the same time, every effort should be made to prevent those destined for deportation from being able to defend themselves against being transported to Africa. Foreign courts, they mean international courts that Great Britain serves, should no longer interfere in national matters, as Sunak explained in the best Brexit style. And meanwhile, passages that could stand in the way of deportations are to be quickly deleted from domestic human rights legislation. Unwanted legal regulations should be removed from circulation, like the refugees themselves. Many lawyers on the island consider this a dangerous development. They speak of a targeted attack on the judiciary and the separation of powers in the state. Lord Carlisle, one of the most prominent upper house lawyers, warned on Thursday against a step towards totalitarianism. What remains unforgotten is how Boris Johnson once wanted to force Parliament to pause for a while in 2019 because parliamentarians opposed his Brexit plans. At that time, the people's representation was the obstacle to an administration that saw itself as sovereign. This time, the problem for the Conservatives is human rights and refugee conventions, the same European and United Nations conventions that London helped create in the wake of 2 world wars. Moderate Tories also warn that Sunak's law is reaching the limits of what is acceptable. The very idea of declaring a country safe by parliamentary resolution just because it suits the government has caused unrest, especially since London has repeatedly granted asylum to people who had fled to the UK from Rwanda in recent years. Experts also doubt the deterrent effect of the threat of deportation. After all, Home Secretary James Cleverly, who is outwardly promoting the Rwanda plans, has called them stupid in private circles. And Sunak, for his part, is said to have tried to dissuade Boris Johnson from the idea 2 years ago. Not because the then Chancellor of the Exchequer found such treatment of refugees immoral, but because the whole thing seemed too expensive for him. In the meantime, with the Tories' mood extremely low, the Rwanda question has become a question of political survival for Rishi Sunak. He wants to see at least one plane take off before calling his fellow citizens to the polls. And if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.